All right, let's get started. Aloha mai kako, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Troy Andrade, and on behalf of the Hawaii State Bar Association Civic Education Committee and the King Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center, it really is my pleasure to welcome you to today's very special conversation with an accomplished panel of scholars and legal practitioners and judges. You know, here in Hawaii, January 30th, today, is set in law as Civil Liberties and the Constitution Day. It's a day that we remember and celebrate heroes like Fred Korematsu, Min Yasui, Gordon Hirabayashi, Mitsuye Endo, all these individuals who stood up particularly against Japanese-American incarceration during World War II and took a stand really for equity and equality in our community. This year, and we do this every year, but this year we've chosen to spend our Civil Liberties and the Constitution Day celebrating diversity in our community. And so before we jump into this really exciting conversation, I'd like to recognize and thank Matt Matisse and Brianna Govea for their extraordinary help to put this program together and all the many programs that the History Center puts together throughout the years. For those of you that are joining us via Zoom, you'll find at the bottom of your screen a question and answer widget that you can submit questions to our speakers. So please, throughout the program, feel free to submit your questions and we'll try to get to as many of them throughout our time together. It is now my pleasure to pass the virtual microphone over to my colleague and friend from the History Center, Brianna Govea. Brianna is the curator of collections and programs at the History Center and is a longtime supporter of civics education. She's done a tremendous job leading the programming efforts at the History Center prior to, during, and even now after as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. So please join me in welcoming Brianna to introduce our panelists.
Mahalo, Troy. And thank you everyone for joining us today. If you weren't aware, Professor Troy Andrade is a law professor and director of the Ululehua Scholars Program at the William S. Richardson School of Law. And his research and work in particular focus on race and law in America, specifically concerning the Native Hawaiian community. So I just want to say mahalo to you, Troy, for always being a fantastic program partner with us here at the History Center. And it's always a pleasure to co-host with you. So I'm very happy to be doing this with you tonight. Before we get started, a friendly reminder that the webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted on the Judiciary History Center's YouTube channel. We'll send a follow-up email to everyone who's joining us with a link to our YouTube channel and to a recording of the program. We ask that you submit questions during this program using the Q&A box at the bottom of your webinar screen, and we will have time towards the end of the program for taking live audience questions. While the remarks shared today don't necessarily represent opinions of the judiciary, I'd like to thank Chief Justice Mark Rechtenwald and the Hawaii State Judiciary and Legislature for their continued support of our mission and for providing this venue for discussion. Now on to our distinguished panelists. The Honorable Rebecca Copeland is a District Family Court Judge for the First Circuit of Oahu, lead judge of the Family Court Special Division, and she presides over Truancy Court. She's also co-chair of the Judiciary's Committee on Equality and Access to the Courts and Access to Justice Commission's Committee on Increasing Pro Bono Services. Say that 5 times fast. Judge Copeland has served on boards for the Hawaii LGBT Legacy Foundation and Equality Hawaii. In 2015, she successfully advocated for the passage of the Transgender Birth Certificate Bill and Transgender Insurance Bill. She's a proud mother of 2 LGBTQ+ children, and we're very excited to have her on the panel. Next, we have the Honorable Lisa Ginoza, Chief Judge of Hawaii's Intermediate Court of Appeals and co-chair of the Judiciary's Commission to Promote and Advance Civic Education. She's a graduate of Richardson School of Law as well and served as a law clerk to the Honorable Samuel P. King in the U.S. District Court for the District of Hawaii. After a rich career in civil litigation, she was appointed as First Deputy Attorney General for the state of Hawaii, where she served until her appointment to the Intermediate Court of Appeals, where she's been since 2010. And finally, we have Dr. Akiemi Glenn, linguist, social science researcher, and culture worker. She's founder and executive director of the Pōpolo Project, a nonprofit that explores the African and Pacific diasporas in Hawaii. And she meets this theme at the intersection of art, social justice, and education. So I encourage you all to check out her organization and the programs they're going to be having this month for Black History Month. Dr. Glenn received her PhD and MA in linguistics from UH Manoa and has spent over 15 years as an educator and policy developer in Indigenous language revitalization. So we have some pretty amazing individuals here on the panel joining us for a rich discussion to talk about diversity in our community as it relates to civil liberties. And so I'd like to get us started asking just a general statement for all of our panelists to respond to, and that is, how do you define diversity, and why is diversity so important? I can choose someone. How about let's start with Dr. Glenn.
Thank you. Mahalo to all of you for the invitation to be a part of this conversation. I'm really excited to be with you today. So this question of how do we define diversity, I want to problematize a little bit. I think we all know what diversity means. It means that we have a range of people from various racial, socioeconomic, cultural backgrounds who we actively seek out and include in social spaces and institutions. But I think it's important to say that diversity alone doesn't necessarily suggest that we have a just inclusion in those spaces. And in fact, diversity itself is a precondition for inequality. We have to have different kinds of people and different categories that they've been assigned to in order to create social hierarchy. So I think when we talk about diversity, it's really crucial for us to do that within a historical and political context that allows us to understand how diversity has been weaponized against communities, even here in a place like Hawaii, where we really celebrate that diversity. And it's important for us to also name diversity in contrast to its opposite, what we're trying to remedy. So often when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we kind of focus on the positive. But I think in many instances, it's important for us to also be honest about what we're trying to remedy. So when we talk about diversity, we also have to acknowledge institutional homogenization. When we talk about inclusion, we also have to talk about exclusion. So I hope that as we continue the conversation today, that we can really take a critical look at how we use the term diversity and what we really mean when we employ it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Glenn. That was a lot to digest in an opening statement, but I really appreciate you pointing out how it actually precludes inequality. So thank you so much for sharing that. Do either of the judges on the panel want to add anything to how diversity comes up through the court system?
Well, I'd be happy to jump in. Not as eloquently as Dr. Glenn, but I kind of wanted to share sort of when I thought about diversity and, being a part of this panel, the first word that came to my mind is merit, is trying to allow individuals to be perceived, to be treated, and to live their life based on their merit. And that, and maybe that's just a court lawyerly kind of perspective on it. It really is, to me, hopefully creating circumstances that preclude false barriers to individuals seeking, what they might choose their path to be, for instance, or how they live their lives, or how their families live their lives. And really, in the courts, it's about fair representation. Again, not having, preconceived notions about individuals when they are being judged in the courts, and that they are receiving fair treatment in the court system. I mean, that goes to so many different parts of what the courts are seeking to do. But I'll kind of stop there. There's a lot of programming. There's a great deal of effort and thought that goes into how the courts in Hawaii can address these issues. And Chief Justice Rechtenwald in particular has really, I think, done a tremendous job in affirmatively seeking out ways to create a fair, representative court system in Hawaii. And as we go along in this conversation, I'd be happy to talk more about that. But I'll stop and pass the baton to Judge Copeland.
Thank you. I agree. And I was just going to add to what Chief Judge Ginoza mentioned, being a trial court judge. So, you know, being sort of a line judge, we get quite a few, obviously, individuals from different backgrounds, ethnicities, socioeconomic backgrounds. And in trying to present that safe space, we really strive to do so respectfully. And you're seeing the same things that Dr. Glenn mentioned. I mean, you know, you can clearly define it in categories, but we also have to look at it in a more holistic view and the individuals that are coming before the court. So what, whether it's programming or just what we do on a daily basis, for example, in the family court and the other trial courts, it really is an important concept for us to always be considering really on a daily basis and a case-by-case basis to make sure that what we're doing within the courts is respecting not only the diversity in the community, but the historical, you know, impacts of how that's been viewed in our community as well.
Great. You know, maybe I'll stick with you, Judge Copeland. In your personal experience, and this is fair game for anyone else too who wants to jump in, but you know, sort of given your personal and professional career, where do you see law and public policy intersecting with diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I mean, it intersects at every level. So, I mean, you know, with our legislature, obviously that's a direct impact on, you know, laws that are considered that impact civil rights on a daily basis. I mean, how we interact with people in the community and how those individuals come before us. I mean, as the mother of, you know, one child who identifies as transgender and the other who identifies as non-binary, that's every aspect of your life. And it impacts every aspect of, you know, how we function, how I function as a judge, how we function as a judiciary, how I look at those around me, you know, how I consider, you know, laws, again, that are being passed at the legislature. So I think it's really every part of our lives, especially when, you know, we consider all the varying categories that we're talking about with diversity.
And so when we think through sort of the ways in which these decisions are made, whether that's at the judiciary or in the legislative body, I mean, in what ways can decision makers, you know, those with power, be more, how can they effectively engage in issues of diversity?
Is that back to me?
Sorry, this is for anybody.
Okay.
Just sort of shoot it up here.
Okay, I mean, number one, you have to understand that there are different views out there and you have to respect individuals with different views. But you also have to think about what Dr. Glenn was mentioning, which is sort of the historical impacts of, you know, the issues behind diversity. And until you get to the point where you're willing to accept that there are differing views, create a safe space for those respectful communications to occur, you cannot have like meaningful change in areas that are confronted in the law. So I think that's step one, but I'll let somebody else take over too.
Okay, I'll unmute here. I guess when I think about, you know, from our role as judges, I mean, really, I was just talking to a group earlier, you know, for us, we don't seek out issues to solve, right? Parties come to the courts to solve disputes, issues, and we get involved in a wide range of things and have to, you know, we do have to resolve a lot of issues that deal with diversity issues in the sense of, for instance, discrimination cases, you know, harassment type cases, and there are a fair number of those that actually do reach the appellate courts. I will say, you know, for the judges, and certainly at the appellate court, what we are looking to apply though is existing law to the facts of a particular case, right? We're not, unlike the legislature, which is able to seek out issues to resolve, same-sex marriage, discrimination, changing the statute as to what will be discriminatory, categories, etc. The courts act in a very different way. However, I think what is important is that the courts be a safe place itself, that place that people feel they can trust to resolve issues in a fair manner. And as part of that, that includes having a diverse judiciary, having an institution that people feel understands the community, because we hopefully reflect the community in a real and perceived way. So it's kind of digressing from the question, I think, but I think it's important to really recognize the role that we are here to serve. And very different, for instance, than what Dr. Glenn, I think, engages in on a daily basis.
Judge Ginoza, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question, since you mentioned a really good distinction between the legislature and judiciary's roles, as in being proactive or reactive to seeking justice in the community. So how do Hawaii's courts promote equity and inclusivity through their particular design in the different types of courts we have, right? So there's family court, women's court, and how is this more broad interpretation of administering justice to the community by having specific departments that interact with particular segments of the society? How does that promote diversity and equity, but also where do we have room to grow from that?
Mm-hmm. So I think our courts really, our core mission, I think, is right, resolving the cases before us. And this kind of goes to what CJ Rechtenbaugh was talking about in his State of the Judiciary just the other day. Because of our role, we see so many of the issues facing the community, and our judges, like Judge Copeland and others, can really, I think, gain insight as to how maybe we can help to solve, resolve, create opportunities for folks to avoid the court system. So we have girls' court, we have women's court, we have veterans' court, we have family court. These are just an example of some of the courts, drug court, but they're specialty courts to try to focus on underlying issues that lead to individuals having to become involved or getting involved in the legal system, and seeking ways to help them to redirect or to find opportunities to provide resources to help folks in the community so that they don't have to come to the court system, whether it's in the criminal system or otherwise. How does that promote diversity? I think it's all about recognizing that everybody comes from different places. It's about recognizing that we all have our own stories, that we all have our own challenges and and good things that come with our lives. But for those who are in the court system that need help, then I think these kinds of courts really focus in on how can we help them outside of just that court, in helping them resolve that particular case, help find resources perhaps that can help them going forward.
I agree. And being the, what Chief Judge Ginoza is indicating is, we see a diverse group of people that come before our courts. And so, for example, you might have trial judges presiding over parental termination cases or juvenile cases. And through viewing and participating and presiding over those cases, you notice that one thing that many children struggle with is getting to school. So, that's like the impetus behind truancy court, which I preside over. And what are the reasons why, someone isn't able to go to school? And that's a variety of reasons, within those different categories of diversity that might create, the issues that prevent somebody from going to school. And even though, we call it truancy court and, a few kids come into court, what we're doing is trying to create those resources and pathways to actually prevent them from coming into court. So our probation officers and staff work with hundreds of, children to try to help them. And I only see, a small fraction of that. And that's the work that the judiciary does within this overall concept of the diverse clientele that we serve. And then, the next step is we notice, well, what happens, because truancy court is middle school, right? What about students who are younger than that or older than that? So then we're starting now to take steps to make sure that we address those issues in other age groups too.
Just to follow up on that really quickly, to what extent does this sort of larger historical context play into sort of the ways in which either, truancy court is expanded or the individual decisions that are made in for each child that comes before you, Judge Copeland?
Well, I think it plays to it in a variety of ways. I mean, we have, sort of a melting pot of cultures here. So you see individuals from different areas and understandings of, kind of the programs that are in place is different for different cultures. A wide variety of socioeconomic, backgrounds and, historically how that's been treated, within the community. And those are the types of things that all sort of come together when we're looking at something like truancy court, because we have to recognize that if we don't recognize where people come from and, just the historical impacts of things like, being from a lower socioeconomic status or being an immigrant, from another area and being new to Hawaii and how that impacts you. We have to look at all of that to be able to, really work with people in a meaningful way. And not just in truancy court, that would be, any of the specialty courts.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Dr. Glenn a question. And, there's often, it's often said out there about diversity issues that there's a cost benefit, right? If one group benefits another, and this sort of gets to your comment about disrupting term diversity, right? If one group benefits, then there's arguably another group that is detrimented by whatever action, whatever conduct is taken. So in your own thoughts, I mean, do you have any thoughts about that, that line of thinking, and, does this hinder progress towards equity? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's probably not a surprise that I might want to reframe that proposition a little bit. I think, as presented, that proposition is really relying on a zero-sum kind of game theory, that there are finite resources, and if I benefit, you will lose. And I think when we actually look at how our society is structured and look at the different ways that individuals are positioned and move in our society, and also, again, the histories of marginalization and oppression, it's not a binary system, right? It's definitely multivalent. And so I would push back on someone who would present that proposition to me and say, there's so many ways that we can easily see that increasing access to institutions, increasing access to social space has a net benefit for the society as a whole. I think, of course, these are conversations that come up around, for example, affirmative action, which has been in the courts for a long time, and certainly has heated up recently. There's this idea that if you allow certain people preferential treatment, however that is framed, that you're actively excluding other people. But then there are other questions that we can ask. What about, just as both of the judges just alluded to, what about creating programs that are responsive to lots of different kinds of people where they are? So the affirmative action conversation becomes so crucial when we put all of the value in higher education in a particular institution. So a lot of the cases recently have been about prestigious institutions that set out the trajectory for their graduates, of their career, of their lives in many ways. Rather, we might want to ask a different question. What if we took some of those resources and made them available in public schools or in community colleges even, or even if we disrupted the idea that getting a PhD or getting an Ivy League degree sets you vastly apart from people who come from a similar background to you. So I think I would really push back on the initial framing. I think it's true that in our society, there's a sense that there are limited resources. And if someone gets a little more access, it could impinge on someone else's access or their control over those resources. But there are lots of different models for how we can share. And I think that gets to your question about equity, that when we think about equity, it's not just about access. It's really about thinking about how those resources are made available in a number of ways.
Great.
Thank you, Dr. Glenn. That was really, really interesting. And again, a lot to think about, that idea of promoting someone else's civil liberties at the expense of your own or the majority. Do either of the judges have anything to add about that? Maybe looking at a specific policy or law that was passed where, it may have addressed a narrow group initially, but there was broader benefits for our society at large or for different groups. Is there anything that comes to mind? I'm thinking maybe Judge Copeland, if you could talk about the impact of the transgender bills that you helped get passed.
Sure, but I mean, I would just say in the sense of, what Dr. Glenn was indicating is the passage of those bills and extending those rights to, those groups of individuals didn't have an impact on anyone else's rights. So I think that's part of understanding that it's not a limited resource. It's not finite. I don't know if that answers your question, but I will say that, that's exactly why we do things like the specialty courts, right? Because we see the need to reach out to certain groups, and there could be more specialty courts. I don't, know what those might be, but certainly having those courts does not detract from our ability to, hear all the other cases that we hear within those other contexts. It's just finding ways to use the resources we have to better serve the people that come before us. And they do not, that doesn't impact at all our ability to provide services for other groups. It just helps us, in certain situations when we identify a particular need, and we can make a, bigger difference in the lives of our community members and the people that we serve.
Brianna, can I sort of weigh in a little bit on this? And it's so interesting to listen to Judge Copeland and Dr. Glenn. So what I'm thinking about when you're talking about, is there a zero-sum game? If somebody benefits, does somebody lose? I think it depends on what you're talking about. Because as, for instance, in admissions, there are only so many placements in a year, at a Harvard, whatever school you're talking about, and that is a finite resource, right, every year. So that debate is in that context. But as sort of, what Judge Copeland's talking about, civil liberties, civil rights, whether it's the transgender issue, whether it's same-sex marriage, other types of civil liberties that we're talking about, you're in a different conversation, in my view, at least, because then it becomes the question of I don't know if the word's acceptance or understanding of differences, of our community members. And that's going to really change depending on where you live. And this is where I feel so lucky to live in Hawaii, because I feel at least that we have a much more invested community in trying to understand each other. Whether it's that aloha spirit, that we talk about, yes, we have lots of challenges and issues but it is a little bit different than what others face in other locations. So I think it's in that context of those rights, those types of rights, it's of course not a zero-sum game. It's that if through education and having those kinds of discussions that we really want to have with each other in real ways that people feel safe to have, we can really lift each other up. We can really, empower everyone to lead the kind of lives that they hope to. We're not talking about the economic stuff, that's a whole different situation. But right, in terms of, having grown up here, I always have felt so lucky to share in the cultures of all of the folks that I grew up around. And that is just a big treasure. Now, in terms of rights and abilities to live our life in the ways that we choose to, that's a different question, because sometimes laws have to be passed in order to allow folks to have the kind of rights that some will want to have and others may not appreciate. So I think it's a little bit contextualized in terms of how we're talking about the cost, who gains and whether somebody loses.
And I'll just follow up and say, nowhere is perfect and nothing is perfect, but I am not from here and I did not grow up here. And in my experience, there is a more open and safe space to have those conversations in Hawaii than in other places, which is why we're able to have this conversation, get the passage of something like marriage equality or the transgender birth certificate bill, where those conversations are more difficult to have maybe in other places.
Go for it, Brianna.
Sorry to cut you off, Troy. I just wanted to send us into the next question about healthy disagreement, since it seems to be kind of on top of mind here. Is how do we keep space for difference in opinion, because that is another type of diversity of thought, of belief, of ethos. So I just want to pose to our panelists, in such polarized times, how do we keep space for differences in opinion and for those healthy conversations to be had so we can move forward and make progress on these issues? Anyone want to chime in?
Okay, I'm going to take a stab at this. Well, first of all, if it's a question of our generation, I think, of our time right now. I'm going to give a plug to something that Professor Andrade and I are working on, which is civic education. And it has to start young. It has to start, across all age groups, but we have to, all of us, make an effort to teach those around us about, and teach is too strong, but to share, our thoughts that we have to have these abilities to have conversations, that we have to, not to take offense so much at what people think and say, and rather, use our ears more and not so much want to, jump in with trying to make a point that we want to make. And part of it is civic education and allowing all of us to know that we have an ability to affect change. We all have an ability in our wonderful democracy to participate, and that and hopefully that empowers folks to want to have conversations. Because I think what we hear so much is everybody just kind of gives up. Why should I vote? Why should I even bother? Because my vote's not going to matter. And we have to change that kind of mindset to get folks involved, to want to make the changes that they want to see. So it's a huge issue. It's a huge issue. I think there's, aspects of the media that are involved. There's aspects of the social media that are involved, that we have to be willing to pull ourselves away from just hearing the things that we want to hear because we believe them all, and just get that reinforced, and have folks be willing to listen to other points of view. And that can start in the schools. It really can. And that's why I think civic education is so important at a very young age.
Others thoughts on, how we sort of keep space for healthy disagreements or engagement?
Dr. Glenn, I'm wondering, is there such thing as a healthy disagreement?
Wondering that too, and I realize that I'm the odd person out in some ways, not being a legal practitioner, so I don't have to necessarily keep the same objectivity. But I do think that's a reasonable question to raise, whether it's possible to have healthy disagreements across the board. Of course, in the abstract, yes, and just as Judge Ginoza said, it definitely depends on the context. Of course, as we're thinking about civil rights and access to the social world that we inhabit together, I think we need to have a finer point on that question. I am the daughter of people who were raised in the Jim Crow South. My grandparents were not able to go to integrated schools. I was the first generation to go to integrated schools in my entire family history, as far as I know. And there were people even in my growing up in Virginia, rural Virginia, where I grew up, who were still very much opposed to the idea that a child who looked like me would be sitting next to their child in a public classroom. There may have been a disagreement about what a public classroom should look like, but I don't know how healthy it is to just necessarily entertain each side. I think, the earlier comments about context and thinking about the historical structure of our society, who has traditionally had access, I think is really, really crucial. And to the question about, how do we keep space for dialogue? I think one of the things that we must do is what was just mentioned with the civic education project that you folks are working on. We have to practice that. I think about the difference in my generation's experience from my parents. And part of what was different was that we had an opportunity to wrestle with some of the difficult questions. And I think the generation that's growing up now, who are in school now, are getting to wrestle with those questions in a different way. So part of what allows us to continue to be in dialogue across a community and a culture is practice and having the space to understand that there are many sides to an issue, and that just being open to disagreement just for disagreement's sake sometimes silences people who are the most marginalized. And we need to be attentive to power asymmetries as we have these discussions as well.
Great. So sort of along those lines, and this is for anyone, aside from education, there's also, critical thinking that we think about as sort of ways in which to engage in DEI issues. When you think about things like the massive misinformation campaigns that are going on, and sometimes technology that comes in with all these algorithms that sort of predict certain things, what role do you think there is for those types of, or what are the ways in which we can push back against those types of, whether that's technology or misinformation, in the ways in which it affects our initiatives for DEI?
Start.
I throw the large questions out at you folks.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the way that you push back and the way you start is through education, and not only civics education, not only education at the top, but I've always been a huge proponent of, I guess, what I'll call interpersonal education. And that's when we're talking to the people around us and we're explaining the experiences that we're talking about, and, what those experiences are like. For me, it's in my role as an ally in the past. But, because I just back to the disagreement thing, I think you can have healthy disagreement, but I agree with Dr. Glenn that at some point you have to understand that it has its limits. But to bridge those, you need the conversations with people, and those conversations happening on an individual level, I've seen make large change, right? From just having individual education and individual conversations. It doesn't all have to be, you know, on a broader level. And I think both of them are important, but I've always been a huge proponent, you know, every person that you're able to make that contact with and explain, you know, the issue to and have a discussion with them, that's someone who can then join the conversation in a constructive way and come up with creative solutions. So that's, you know, that's always been my huge thing, you know, in the advocacy work I did prior to taking the bench, was really the individual education that you do just talking with people.
I guess I'll add a little different wrinkle on that, which I think is so important, Judge Copeland, what you're just saying. I mean, and so holding the role of a judge is a huge privilege. And I think what goes with that is a huge responsibility, not just in the courtroom, but exactly what Judge Copeland is talking about, is to try to share, you know, the insights that we have. And that kind of takes me to why I think it's so important to have a diverse judiciary, you know, to have individuals who are from different parts of our community, who, you know, represent and are part of different parts of our state and can speak directly to their communities or different types of communities. So I just want to mention very quickly that we have on the judiciary website sort of a snapshot of diversity in the state judiciary. And, you know, 49% of our full-time judges are women. And it also breaks down by ethnicity, self-identified ethnicity, the judges in our state. And it's an effort by the courts to sort of, you know, give a snapshot to the public as to who are the individuals who are making the decisions that come to the court. So I think part of it is utilizing that role, and there's many different roles, but I think that's part of what we have to recognize. And whatever role we serve in, we have information, we have some level of knowledge that we can share, to whether it's a 5-year-old kid, you know, next door neighbor, or, you know, grandparents, to help them to understand some things that perhaps they just haven't had the opportunity to be part of or see that we've had the opportunity. So I think it's such an important point that you're making, Judge Copeland, you know, that one-on-one kind of more personal type of communication. I will also just want to add, then there's the other side, which is the media. And that's a whole other thing. If we could really get, you know, the media, some kind of more objective, middle of the road, so to speak, media to educate folks, that would really take us a long way as well.
So if we sort of flip the lens on our own, and I'm talking to the lawyers here, sort of flip the lens to ourselves, right? And looking at our profession, which has generally throughout its history been one of exclusion, right? So it was a male dominated, you know, male exclusive profession. It was a very white profession. And over the years, you know, Hawaii's had a very different trajectory with its legal profession, but it was still a profession of exclusion here. The judiciary, as Judge Ginoza mentioned, has made really significant strides in creating a community that's reflective, a judicial community that's reflective of the community. But I think there's still a long ways to go. What steps do you all think can be taken to, I don't know if the answer is to increase diversity or to make the judiciary more inclusive and accessible, right? And again, another large question.
Well, maybe we can narrow that in, Troy, to thinking about the impact on the Hawaiian community here too. So the indigenous people of this land, how are the courts, how is the civics education serving them, and what more can be done there?
I'll just shortly answer that in this way. On the PACE Commission to Promote and Advance Civic Education, which Professor Andrade is a member of, So we really, in our mission statement, we've adopted the mission to promote civic education in a place-based, culturally sensitive manner, and that statewide, and that really is important to us. And reaching out to communities that are underserved historically, that haven't had the kind of opportunities perhaps that others have had. So a big project that Professor Andrade led, we went to Maui for a 3-day academy and brought in students from Molokai and Lanai and throughout Maui County, because of the very idea that we wanted to seek out, those who have been underserved. And we're just getting started. There's a long way to go, but that's an example of the intention of trying to accomplish reaching out to those communities.
Thank you, Judge Ginoza. We have a Q&A that's come in that I would like us to respond to. Someone's written that the public school education system locally, nationally, does not teach critical thought. Certain civics, as well as creativity, are left behind in the larger education system. So how do you think the work of civics education in particular can tackle that issue of promoting critical thought in participants of our society, with particular attention to the cultural focus here in Hawaii, which is a different mentality than civics federally or nationally? Does anyone want to respond? So many broad, very broad questions tonight. So thank you for sharing some very insightful experiences and interpretations about this. I really appreciate it.
One thing I'll just say is that civics really is all of us, and I think at some point there will need to be a larger effort, and that could include at the legislative level, in terms of righting wrongs in Hawaiian history, and trying to raise up those who have not been necessarily served well in our community. It seems intractable sometimes, but all I would say is we all have to help. We all have to try, and if we don't, then for sure, then we will reap what we sow, so to speak. But I feel like I've met so many people in our state that really have the heart for civics. It's how do we gather that desire to reach out to all of our community to do this? Sometimes, it just takes a concerted effort, and sometimes it takes law changes. I don't know. So I'm just speaking from a point of we're far from being there, but there's no clear path that I can think of other than to put one foot in front of the other, and in your communities where you are, trying to make that difference, because otherwise, it's not gonna happen, I think. So we have to all try.
And if I can jump in real quick, I know I'm not a panelist, but let me, if you don't mind, just to say that I think, when we talk about civics, understanding that civics is not just Congress, the president, and the US Supreme Court, right? And understanding that we should really be teaching our students, everyone in the community, that civics is also localized, right? And understanding the differences between what it is that the state government does, what it is that the county governments do, as opposed to what the federal government does, right? And helping people to find those levers of power that they can use to advocate for whatever issues they are, looking to advocate for.
And I think that's why, I think that's why Chief Judge Ginoza's commission is going into the schools, individually and gaining, many volunteers to do that. Another program that the Judiciary does, I think, that helps with that is the Courts in the Community program. And for example, the most recent program that the Hawaii Supreme Court did for that, they actually had students from Molokai that were able to participate in that. So expanding those types of programs as well, I think, is a form of civics education that helps, a little piece of the puzzle that helps our students gain that additional knowledge of the government and the different branches and, what they mean and how they're working.
One thing quick to add on this, which is where representative government really can matter. I think there's in Congress right now a bill to increase funding for civics across the country. Of course, we're not the only people in the country worried about the engagement of citizens in their democracy. And so there is a concerted effort in Congress to try to restore and replenish funding for civics and to bring resources to it. There is a very robust conversation going on nationwide on this.
Thank you.
Also,
Ginoza.
there are also conversations happening in certain states about certain types of curriculum, right, that can be taught in schools, what can and cannot be taught in schools. And so it's a really interesting time where we're seeing both end, right? We're seeing sort of the push for more engagement in civics, while at the same time pushback from some state governments in terms of what can and cannot be taught in schools, to get to the context of understanding the history and the political nature of how decisions are made and what history is told and taught to students. Anyone have thoughts about those sort of efforts?
I do. I'm just going to say that I think that goes back to each of us individually being willing to, educate others and have those conversations, whatever your position is, in your community, whatever you are able to do within that position. I believe that all of us who are able to speak to people and to educate them have a responsibility to do so, to the extent that we're able to within whatever confines exist of our employment. But I think that's all of our responsibility. It has to be every single person's responsibility to to speak to those types of issues in order to make it better.
Thank you, Judge Copeland. We have another question that came in, echoing again, Troy, your point that civics is more than just the three branches of government. Civic expression can take many forms. How can we encourage alternate forms of civic engagement to promote diversity and equity? So maybe what alternate forms of education in schools or use of social media, technology, curriculum, art, film, how can we use these different media and platforms to promote discussions or progress in diversity and equity that are doing well to serve us today, or aren't yet being utilized or underutilized?
I'd like to chime in. So part of my background has been in working in Indigenous language revitalization context across the US and here in Hawaii and the Pacific. And one of the interesting kind of observations that you can make over the last 25 plus years of this work in communities is that while the target is teaching language or revitalizing Indigenous language, there are a lot of collateral benefits that come from creating the kind of learning environment that would foster those languages. One of the things that we see for students is a sense of belonging and responsibility that is cultivated in those spaces. Often, articulated as the responsibility to take the language forward and to share the language, to practice speaking it, but that can also activate a sense of responsibility in the larger community. And I think here in Hawaii, we see that with the success and the ongoing kind of fight around Olelo Hawaii. And certainly as a generation of students from Punana Leo through the Kaiapuni system have come into adulthood, we find a lot of those folks taking leadership positions in our community across various sectors. And I don't know that we can say that their language instruction was the primary thing, but I think it shows us that they came from a community and a social environment that really invested in them as youth, and also really kind of instilled in them a sense of kuleana and responsibility to those around them. So while we might not think of language education as a place to really, impart civic ideals, there are a lot of ways that we could come at this present moment and really thinking about the whole person and the kinds of support that we might need to show up as our best selves and to look out for other people in our immediate surroundings.
Yeah, it's so amazing what you're saying, Dr. Glenn. And I'm thinking about music, that inspires, movies, documentaries that inspire. And I think that has played a role in the Native Hawaiian, movement in the 70s and forward, particularly. So I'm not a speaker of Olelo Hawaii. I wish I were, but I'm inspired by it when I see it, and I'm inspired by how I see it affecting others, including those in my family who are Native Hawaiian and speak it. So I think it's a fantastic question that came in, because there are ways to reach folks and inspire them other than just teaching them about in school about the 3 branches of government and so forth and so on. I think it's important that they understand how to activate and utilize what they want to accomplish, how to accomplish what they are seeking to. So they need to understand that part of it, but that inspiration can come from so many different ways. Great question.
Thank you, Judge Ginoza. I know we're coming up at time. If anyone has some final questions, please drop them in the Q&A now. And I'll just pose one final question. If no more come in through Q&A, and then Troy, you can go ahead and sign us off after this. But in the context of being empathetic towards everyone in our communities, liberties and rights, how do we, particularly, I want to focus on the education system or folks in the legal system, how do we be good allies to our community and people seeking assistance?
I think we listen. As allies, we are not the journey. We have to listen to other people's journey and other people's experiences, and understand that that it is the person who is going through that journey that needs to guide what we do in education, what we do in advocacy. We're there to help, but we have to let others make the decisions, and understand that even in different contexts, regardless of what group we're speaking of, even within that, there's a lot of diversity. So everyone of a certain group has not had the same experiences or the same journey. And as an ally, the most important thing is to listen and to help others achieve what they believe to be is, how to best move forward to make change meaningfully.
I think that's so well put. I think I would just say that I think about just constantly learning from others. I try to listen. I try to just learn from so many out there that have dedicated themselves to raising up others and trying to connect people who are seeking to help in lots of different ways. So one of the things I think about is for me to continue learning and to help be a connector, if at all possible. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
And I would echo both of those sentiments from the other panelists. I think sometimes we focus on the term ally as kind of an identity that we can stand in. And I think it's important to recognize that what we can do as allies is only as powerful as our coordination with those who are most impacted by the issue at hand. And so our allyship might shift. It might change how we show up. It might shift. It might require of us to marshal our resources or our privilege in different ways. But I just want to echo what the other two have said about learning, listening, but I would also add, be willing to step up to coordinate and to see progress, change, or a victory on the horizon.
Absolutely amazing and inspiring. I knew we got the right folks in our Zoom room for this conversation. If you are there in virtual land, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for their this great and insightful conversation. Thank you to Brianna for co-hosting this. And again, before you jump off, I wanted to thank you all for joining us tonight. And hope that you will attend more of the programs in person that the Judiciary History Center is going to be putting together this spring. They got a ton of things planned. In the past, they've done amazing programs on music and the law, on civil liberties, on people like Patsy Mink. So there's amazing stories out there that the Judiciary History Center is going to continue to tell. And so with that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week and a very happy Civil Liberties and the Constitution Day. Aloha.
Mahalo, Troy. Dr. Glenn, did you want to add anything about the film festival and your work coming up next month before we sign off?
Sure, I'd love to share. We're about to begin Black History Month, and I'd love to invite you all to check out our website, the pōpoloproject.org, if you're interested in events happening around the community. And in particular, I would love to direct you to the Honolulu African American Film Festival, which begins this Thursday evening at the Doris Duke Theater at Honolulu Museum of Art. And if I can, I'll put a link to, I can send it to everyone. I'm not sure if I'm not sure if everyone will see this, but I'll put the link here in the chat.
I can attach the link in the follow-up
Wonderful.
Survey as well that we send out. And so it'll go to attendees as well who didn't attend virtually with us right now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Please be well. Get home safe if you're still at work. And I hope to see you in person at the Judiciary History Center very soon for upcoming program. But until then, please be well. And thank you so much. Aloha.
Thank you, everyone.
Aloha.